All right. Looks like we're now live for the November 2023 Ask Me Anything session. We've already got a few questions lined up, so I am going to take those. Here's an interesting one from Zach. I'm a professor of philosophy now. Pedagogically, thoughts on getting students reinvested in class after feeling like losing them. So, there's a couple things to be said about that. That's actually a kind of a great question. The first thing to say is, well, you don't really know if you've lost them or not because you sometimes have the experience of having a student come up to you later on and saying, "Oh, I've been thinking about that thing that you were talking about. I didn't say anything in class because I didn't feel like I had anything useful to say at that time, but now I've been mulling it over." So you're never quite sure what seeds you've planted in their minds pedagogically, right? But let's say that you actually have lost them, and you haven't lost them forever, right? Because they're going to come back and um, keep, taking class with you. So I think part of what you can do, or maybe two important things. One is to reconnect and reinforce what you were talking about before. And you can say to them, you can be very honest. You can be like, I think I lost a lot of you when we were talking about, Kant's groundwork because you didn't seem to be responding to it at all. It's kind of understandable. It's complicated, difficult material. Here's some of my own thoughts that I've had, since our class session. I'd like to just go back to this thing and highlight this passage. And what you're doing them there is you're showing them that philosophy and really the humanities in general aren't just like this modular thing where we do a bit of this over here and then we do a bit of this over here and none of it's all interconnected to each other. And you're showing them, you're modeling for them how to keep on thinking about something. So I think that could be quite helpful. And then, the other thing that you can do to involve your students a little bit more, coming back to that material, is, see if you can have them think of problems or examples or, raw material that you can then work on and say, well, maybe the answer is already brought up by this person in this text, right? Um, And so, if you get them a little bit more involved in it, then, even if you did lose them, you can bring them back. So that's kind of good. Angry archaeologists, historical methodologies. Is it helpful to contrast Marx's materialistic progressive cause effect economic equals political with Hegel's concept of history, nonlinear, unique social arrangements? I mean, I'd say both of those are actually wrong, as stated. But yeah, you can compare anything you like. It's a free country. You just kind of want to make sure that you're actually getting them correct. It's not like Marx is totally linear and Hegel is nonlinear. They're both, they both view history as having some impasses and then getting past that. And, they're approaching it in different ways. But yeah, you can compare and contrast whatever you like. The question, asking, is it helpful? Helpful is a relative term. Helpful for what? Helpful for writing a, thesis, helpful for understanding the world we live in, helpful for exercising your mind. I mean, it could be helpful for all sorts of things, but that is not something, there's no like helpfulness per se out there that we have as a criterion for something. So, all right, let's take Kevin Sullivan's. This is probably a common question, but what current living philosophers are breaking new ground? Again, depends on what you mean by breaking new ground, right? Um, I mean, Alistair McIntyre is still out there working. Jürgen Habermas is still out there working. Martha Nussbaum is still out there working. To what degree are they breaking new ground? It kind of depends on what you mean by that. Does McIntyre's, latest thing, hopefully he'll be around for, past 100 because he's in his 90s, that he brings out. The latest thing, is it something radically new? Well, we don't need radically new. As a matter of fact, the more radically new something is, the more likely it is to be not particularly good. You want it to build off of things that we already have. Do we have, new ground in interpretation of historical figures? All the time. I mean, look at how Hellenistic philosophy has come to be rethought by so many figures in the last half century, and that's still going on now. So, I mean, if you're looking for a catalog of like who are the hot new philosophers, I'm not the guy to come to for that because I don't jump onto trends. But there's plenty of people doing interesting work out there in the present. You just kind of have to look around for them. All right. Huzaifa says, I want to formally learn philosophy, but can't afford to go to a university for that. What are some alternatives? This is purely for having a deep understanding of philosophy. I'm a medical student. Well, so if you can't afford to do it, then you might not be able to afford like studying with somebody independently, because there's plenty of us out there who offer tutorial services or online classes or things like that. So then you're thinking more about other free alternatives or very inexpensive alternatives. So you have the entire world of the internet out there in front of you. And now there's no substitute for actually reading the texts and studying them. But if you want to know about most interesting philosophers, there are videos out there. There are podcast episodes. You can find quality writings on them, secondary sources. For example, in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you have all sorts of blogs. You have all sorts of cool stuff that's available really for free or for a minimal cost. I mean, some of these things may cost you like $5 a month or something, but you can easily do those. And then the other thing I would say is if you're interested in something in particular, you want to look around for online communities of people who are interested in that same thing. So, for example, if you were interested in Stoicism, Stoic Week is going on starting Monday. And that's a great thing to do, even if you know a little bit about Stoicism already. And then there are not weekly, there are monthly sessions, that are held by the Modern Stoicism organization. Just got to go to their page or YouTube channel, and they're called Conversations with Modern Stoics. So, like next time, it's Christopher Gill, who is a major thinker in Hellenistic philosophy and a great guy all around. And I'll be there for that as somebody participating in the audience, because I want to hear what Chris Gill has to say. And so there's all sorts of opportunities to participate, but you have to do some work. You have to do some research and tracking these things down. You'll be surprised just how much is actually out there available for you. And again, largely for free. All right. Silvio says, my question is about Hegel. I don't understand his insistence on determinacy, specifically in the phenomenology of spirit. I get that it's meant to support systematic thought, but I don't understand why. I think you might be confusing yourself. There's no necessary connection between systematic thought and determination, not determinacy, but determination, bestimmen, right? One of the things that you see Hegel doing in his dialectical approach to things, and he's not the only one to do this, of course. I mean, this is something that goes way, way back to like Aristotle, is saying that, okay, we can talk about, abstract ideas, but what happens when they actually get put into play and practice in real life? What happens when they become, to use another Hegelian term, actual or real, wirklich, right? Um, how does that change or reveal things about the idea that we're working with? And you know, I don't know that that supports systematic thought, but it's certainly, if you want to be systematic and you want to be engaged with reality, which Hegel certainly does, then you have to pay attention to how things do in fact get determined. But I wouldn't get tripped up on trying to figure out what's the connection between these things. With Hegel, probably the best bit of advice that I can give for you is when you get tripped up and you're reading through, say, the Phenomenology of Spirit, keep on reading, see where it goes, because nothing is ever fixed and solved and like, here's my doctrine once and for all at any one single point in the work. There's a lot of moving parts, so to speak, and we have to put them all together. All right. Anthony Summers says, how has your mathematics background helped or hindered your philosophical growth, research, or understanding of philosophy? Um, I mean, I went through a phase that a lot of people, I think, do, whether they have a mathematics background or they're just enamored of mathematics, where I thought that, maybe mathematics could in fact be the key to understanding and formulating everything. I'm in good company with that. I think about, Rene Descartes in his early years, or Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, right? And then you come to realize that mathematics is, a great set of disciplines. There's no such thing, by the way, as mathematics per se. There's all these different mathematical disciplines that are interconnected with each other and tend to have a common approach to matters. Um, and you start seeing the limitations of adopting what you can call a formalist approach to matters that would frame everything in terms of functions and computation. I mean, it's great to actually get to learn the limitations, because then you're not taken in by all these AI hucksters who are like, AI will solve everything, the algorithm, because you're like, yeah, that's not, we're not advanced to the degree that people are putting forward. And even if we were, there's still going to be problems with relying upon formal systems to do that. But I love studying mathematics. I mean, I got into it in college in part because my Calculus 1 class that I got thrown into freshman year, we began with the theory of limits, which is very philosophical. I mean, there's lots of interconnections between mathematics and philosophy. And then I got into studying logic, and not in a sort of superficial way, but in a pretty deep way, reading the cutting edge stuff that was available in journals at the time, and thinking about the nature of logic and how it could be, connected with our actual language and thinking that we use. And that was very useful for me, I would say. I don't know that it would be for everybody. As we grow, our studies are, incorporating the different things that we're studying, and how we're learning it, because you can study mathematics at one place and you'll still study the same concepts and material and applications, but the way that it gets taught to you and it's connected to other things might be very different in another place. So we have to be kind of careful about overgeneralizing about individual instances. All right, Zubair Mir, what's the difference between existentialism and absurdism in simple words, sir? Well, I'm not going to give you simple words, because we're doing philosophy here, and demanding that people put things into simple words is sort of like asking for them to give you what you actually don't want, but don't realize that you don't want. So existentialism can be understood in several different ways, right? As can absurdism. I mean, absurdism can be as trivial as people bullshitting around and just like saying random stuff. By the way, people also used to do that and claim that they were doing Zen as well, right? Very popular in the 80s and early 90s. But if we want to be more technical about it, absurdism is a movement largely. I mean, you could say it goes back to 19th century thinkers as well. You might even trace it back further, but it's largely a 20th century and 21st century movement, and often gets associated with somebody like Albert Camus, who claimed he wasn't an existentialist, and we'll get to that in just a moment. That he was engaging in a philosophy of the absurd. He never calls himself an absurdist, which other people do, in fact, call him, and other authors call themselves absurdists. But, existentialism is a broader category, and it includes absurdists like Albert Camus, depending on what you mean by existentialism. If you're looking at, like, say, the myth of Sisyphus, then look at who he defines as an existentialist. He says Kierkegaard, Jaspers, Shestov, Kafka to a certain extent, right? Dostoevsky to a certain extent, but he doesn't lump Nietzsche in there, and he doesn't talk at all about Sartre or de Beauvoir, or I don't even think he talks about Gabriel Marcel in that either. In point of fact, existentialism is a broad, loose movement that includes even people who say that they're not existentialists, because we've rightly in philosophy identified them as fitting into the existentialist pantheon, or whatever you want to call it, the existentialist spectrum. So an absurdist like Albert Camus is actually an existentialist as well, an existentialist in the broad sense, not in the sense that he defines it over and against his own stuff. Same thing with Jean-Paul Sartre, just going the other way. He tries to give a definition of existentialism that a lot of other existentialists don't actually agree on. That, it's the doctrine that existence precedes essence, and here's what I mean by it, right? Well, Sartre doesn't get to claim that space, right? And so Gabriel Marcel, who's the first person to actually use the term existentialism in French, has just as good of a claim to it as Sartre does. Even though, Marcel will say, yeah, Sartre, you can have the word, I'm going to call what I'm doing Christian Socratism. So, is there really a difference, the difference between existentialism and absurdism? There isn't. Think of them as overlapping with each other to a very significant extent, in part because they're both loose movements, and you don't want to tie yourself in with like rigid, well, existentialism over here, absurdism is over here. There's a nice, neat dividing line. There isn't. And that's the way it actually works for a lot of isms in philosophy, I'll say, just to bring this to a close. All right, John says, good evening from Norway. When you studied ancient Greek, did you read any poetry, either epic, lyric, or pastoral poetry? Do you have any favorites? Yeah, I mean, we read selections of poetry, and poetry includes dramatic. You've got epic, lyric, and I mean, they don't actually have a category back then of pastoral poetry. That's sort of a modern thing that would basically fit under lyric, as far as I understand. But dramatic poetry, the comedies and tragedies, and yeah, I mean, we read Homer, spent an entire semester on the Odyssey. And read other stuff as well. I mean, I read quite a bit of Solon because I was interested in political philosophy, and he wrote a lot of his stuff as lyric poetry. you know so yeah, I mean, when you're studying as a student, what you do first is like learn the grammar and some vocabulary, and then you start reading short passages, and then you'll take like semester long classes with people studying an author. Like I think I got to do 5 semester-long reading classes. One was on Plato's Symposium. One was, like I said, Homer's Odyssey, Herodotus, the history, um, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And then we had another class where we read Plato's. What did we read? The Credo. We read some of Lysias's speeches, and we read um, Lucian's True History, right? So, and you also get some like parody of poetry in there as well, because like Plato is constantly mentioning poetry, right? So he brings up poetic passages, has people like often use them almost like fundamentalists do with proof texting. Well, Homer says, or Simonides says, right? You see this a lot in Plato. So then you read it in the the little couplet or passage there. All right. Burn Grace, what do you think of Badiou's interpretation of Plato? I don't think anything of Badiou's interpretation of Plato because I don't spend really any time reading Badiou. He's there's so many contemporary authors that I don't stay on top of that. Sansi says, do you know of any good contemporary works that apply Stoic philosophy to issues of racism? Um, Not offhand, but I mean it's pretty straightforward. A Stoic is going to be against racism because they consider humanity as a whole to be the human race, right? And it's interesting because when we talk about the indifference, the class of things in the middle that don't have, moral goodness or moral badness to them, but have some sort of limited value, one of the examples that the Stoics would actually use of something that is truly indifferent is the color of a person's skin, whether black or white. They were like, that doesn't matter at all. And you could say, well, people were, ethnocentric back then. Yeah, but not in the same way that we are today, where people like to talk about a white race or stuff like that. I mean, the Stoics would look at racism as being a form of injustice. And I mean, it's a good thing to know because there's a lot of right wingers who want to try to use bits and pieces of things from ancient philosophy. And as soon as you start studying the ancient philosophy, you realize that these people haven't studied it and they're full of crap. And, the ancient philosophy would actually go against their point of view, and Stoicism is a great example of that. To be a Stoic, you would need to be committed to cosmopolitanism, to an entire commonwealth of human beings, and then if we believe in gods, of gods as well. This is a consistent Stoic doctrine, and that you know discriminating against people on the basis of irrational distinctions that don't really make any serious moral difference is evil and unjust. So, but is there contemporary literature out there about that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, Christopher Gill's latest book, which I don't have my hands on because it's kind of expensive, might actually consider that. So, all right. Let's see here. Ben Felt says, as a writer, how do you overcome the feeling that everything you want to write about has been written and better by somebody else? This is clearly an unhelpful and untrue mindset to have. Okay, so part of what can help you there is that last sentence. This is clearly an unhelpful and untrue mindset to have. And the untrue is the important part. And we could add to that unverifiable. I mean, how would you possibly know that in advance that anything that you are going to write has already been written by somebody else? Um, that seems a very, very strong claim to make. And now, like you said, it corresponds to a feeling, but it doesn't make that a true claim just because we have that feeling. Um, so, questioning that can be quite helpful. And then, thinking about, okay, what do we mean by already been written by somebody else? Somebody else has said the exact same words. That's pretty unlikely. Somebody else has already addressed the topic. Well, so what? That doesn't mean that they exhausted the topic or they've talked about it in the only one true legitimate way to talk about it. I mean, I talk about cats all the time. Human beings have been living with cats, since prehistory. And people have written an awful lot of things about cats, but that doesn't mean that every time that I talk about, Sassy and the special relationship that we had and developed, or why that after her death, that leads me to volunteering at Almost Home Cat Shelter, that somebody else is out there writing about that. As a matter of fact, I probably need to do more writing about that sort of thing, because there hasn't been enough writing about it that could reach people and tell them, hey, it's okay to grieve in this way, and you don't need to replace your animal with another animal. You can do something else instead, right? So you can think that you you don't have to bring something unique or completely unheard of to the table in order for it to be valuable. you know um so you might actually get more mileage out of like thinking, okay, what isn't getting enough attention? What could I write about that people would benefit from learning or hearing? So, all right, Mark, hey, good to see you here. I hope you are all well and have a good month ahead. Question: favorite monster from any media? Favorite monster? Oh, that's kind of good. I mean, I am teaching Frankenstein again in one of my classes, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And if for any of you who haven't read that book, so there's, the monster, and the monster is actually a conscious, thoughtful, morally ambiguous, but rational being who has a lot of interesting things to say. And I think Mary Shelley did a pretty good job. It's interesting. My students are like, they're not doing the easy thing. Frankenstein is the true monster. They're more like Frankenstein is really a jerk. I mean, he creates this thing, and then, when it comes alive, he's surprised that he's been successful and he swoons, and, he's revengeful towards it. And he goes back on his promise to create a fellow creature and all that. So, I mean, Frankenstein's monster in the original is pretty good, not the stupid, fumbling around animated corpse that movies have made it out to be. I mean, we get a lot of cool, let's look at things from the perspective of the monster literature in speculative fiction throughout the years, so, but I guess maybe Frankenstein is it. um Jonathan says, how should I go about getting a master's in philosophy? I have a bachelor's in another field. Well, the first thing you'd have to do is start researching programs where you would want to apply, because if just talking about the American situation here, we have, hundreds of places you could go and study and get a master's in philosophy. And they don't all do the same thing. They don't all have the same curriculum. They don't even all have the same entrance admission standards. Some of them aren't going to be interested in you without a bachelor's degree in philosophy. Some of them aren't going to be interested in you, period, because of weird vagaries, like they're looking for people who are interested in this semester, or the professors can't get along. Like when I applied actually for graduate school, one of the places that I was accepted to wrote me back and said, we had a big fight between professors in our department, and so many of them left that now we can't offer the program that we were. Call back in a couple of years. That was DePaul University, when they essentially booted all the analytic philosophers out and the Continentals took over. So you want to like research, you want to like look into the places that you might be interested in. You should contact them right away. There'll be somebody who's called a director of graduate admissions, and you can ask them, okay, I don't have a degree in philosophy. Hopefully you have a degree in something that's close to it, like history or English or one of the other humanities. Um, what would I need to do to get into the program? And they might tell you, well, you need a BA. Um, or they might say, well, we'll take you in provisionally, but you're going to have to take some makeup classes, some 400 level classes where seniors and graduate students can take them because you need to have a background in this, this, and this, and this, right? That might be what they end up recommending or requiring for you. So, you know, it really depends quite a bit. All right. Save Self, as someone who recently learned about formal systems, I deeply appreciate this discussion on mathematics. Yeah. Back Moon, which of Derrida's writings do you think are worth reading, and which do you think aren't, and which insights do you think he has? So I think Derrida's early work is quite rigorous and well worth reading, and I think there's some great insights, not all of which are as earth shaking as they were made out to be at the time. Like, there's nothing outside of the text. Yeah, no shit, you know? I mean, everything is tied up with language in one way or another. You're never going to get something that's purely outside of language, at least for us human beings. But it's cool what he does. I mean, I got attracted to Derrida because I was kind of doing what he was doing without knowing that it was Derridian deconstruction. With saying, okay, we got various systems here. How can the system actually say something about itself within the system? It's part of what deconstruction does, right? And deconstruction's answer is it only does so imperfectly, right? So on grammatology, really big early book, speech and phenomena, a little bit before that. Um, Writing and difference, those are sort of like the early three that you should start with. And then Derrida has all these other works where maybe you'd find him interesting, maybe you'd find him to be a waste of time. Like I think his book on Hegel, not even worth bothering with. But occasionally he has some interesting insights along the way. And then towards the end of his life, like maybe the last decade and a half, he becomes very interested in questions that he hasn't adequately considered of politics and religion, and he comes out with a whole bunch of pretty good books. They could have used some editing, because they're all mostly lectures, like The Gift of Death and Specters of Marx and The Politics of Friendship, right? That's pretty good stuff. Um, and he's kind of insightful in that he realized long before the rest of us that the issue of hospitality and immigration is going to become massive in terms of political issues in ways that we didn't realize. And he was writing about this in the early to mid 90s. So, that's good. All right. Who framed the Socratic method? Do you have a favorite short story? I don't have favorite really much of anything. Uh, there's, I think, as you get older, um, and your experience broadens, you find that you have things that you really like, but they're not your favorite in the sense of like um, ruling out other things as being on their same level. Like I don't have a favorite band, although I can tell you who I really like. I don't have a favorite meal, although I can tell you the ones that I really like. And I don't have a favorite short story, although I can tell you the ones I really like. And I don't have a favorite philosopher either. But some can be higher up and some can be lower down. All right, William Zen says, I'm reading Friedrich Nietzsche. I cannot understand most of what I read. Should I rely on secondary sources like Friedrich Cobblestone or keep plowing through the works of Nietzsche? Well, I think the first thing you want to do is think about why and what you're not understanding. And that'll help you figure out what you ought to do. If you're just jumping into Nietzsche as like your first philosopher that you're reading, he's making all these allusions to other philosophers. So you're not going to know what the hell he's saying, right? He also does things in a very conversational, polemical sort of way. Maybe that's not a style that you're used to. He also doesn't value consistency, and maybe you really demand consistency out of an author, right? So you want to think about why you're not understanding things. There's nothing wrong with reading secondary literature. You don't want to remain content with just relying on secondary literature because you don't actually know whether the secondary literature is getting the author right until you go back to the author. But there's nothing wrong with reading, Cobbleston, or, I mean, if you want to get a wrong-headed thing, Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy. Um, there's plenty of other Nietzsche people out there that you could read. Um, so, yeah, nothing wrong with that. But again, I think you want to think about why you're having trouble with it, and realize too that Nietzsche is not an easy author, right? Maybe what you are confusing with having a general idea, you actually do understand it more than you realize, but you don't understand it fully, right? And you're confusing understanding it fully with not understanding it at all, right? So, all right, Mage of War. I homeschool my children. Do you think teaching them medieval logic would be advantageous or disadvantageous to their development? I mean, why would it possibly be disadvantageous? I mean, unless you're teaching it in terrible ways, which a lot of homeschoolers probably do because they think, I mean, it depends on why you're homeschooling, right? I mean, let's be honest about that. A lot of homeschooling is actually kind of just, I don't want my kids in the public schools, and, it's culture war kind of stuff. And people like that make terrible teachers, I think. But if you're actually homeschooling your kids because you want them to get a great education, why would you possibly not introduce them to a topic like medieval, authors on logic? And keep in mind there is no medieval logic out there. There's a whole bunch of different authors doing different things, and they're not all on the same level. So if somebody's selling you a medieval logic textbook and it basically is just warmed over Aristotle stuff, and you're not actually reading, say, Peter Abelard or Boethius or people like that, now you got a problem, right? But there's nothing wrong with incorporating that. I mean, don't pretend that logic it translates automatically into real life. And if you're going to do logic, you probably also need to teach them, literature, which is part of the trivium, under grammar, and rhetoric as well, right? So. All right, Max Montague, how do you think Kant's Tugendlehre of his metaphysics of morals roughly fits into and adds to his ethical philosophy? Unfortunately, there's few resources for helping to understand the work. So let's start out. Tugendlehre, you don't have to call it that. Just call it the virtue portion, right? Because that's what the Tugend there means, and Lehre just means teaching. So the metaphysics of morals, which is what the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals is, the groundwork too, has two parts: the metaphysical elements of right, social philosophy, political philosophy, metaphysical elements of virtue, more personal stuff. I think it's actually, that's one of his easiest works. It's very straightforward. I think Kant is, good in explaining stuff there. Um, the whole point of the groundwork is to be the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, right? It's where he starts getting much more clear and specific about what does ethics actually really look like. The groundwork is great. The second critique is awesome, but the metaphysics of morals is the actual ethical philosophy. So, that's how does it fit into and add to the ethical philosophy? It is the ethical philosophy. It fit into and add to it. It is, where he's actually telling you what he thinks virtuous or righteous behavior looks like. There's one other book that I would say is particularly important in terms of Kant's ethics, and it's kind of to a lot of people, it's going to sound like a weird one: Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, which is about religious topics, but is also very much about ethics, because Kant effectively turns his conception of good religion into ethics. So yeah. All right, Tashi, and what are some texts that a philosophy student read concerning gender, transsexuality, genderness, gender fluidity? I read Butler's work and I found the concept of performativity interesting. I don't know, because that's not an area that I really specialize in. I mean, there's probably a vast literature out there. Butler, of course, is pretty important because of her notion of performativity. I mean, I think you could go back into um, earlier feminist authors and say what they have to say. For example, in Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, can there be a third sex? How do these things play out in an existentialist perspective, right? Um, so, I don't really know. I don't have recommendations about that sort of thing, but maybe somebody else out there does. Um, Westwood, what was one of the most profound things you read about that got you into philosophy? Well, there wasn't any one single thing that got me into philosophy. Um, my history with it is thinking about things quite a lot as a kid and not thinking about it being told that counts as philosophy, and then later on finding out that there was this discipline out there called philosophy, and taking a particularly bad philosophy class in high school, an intro to philosophy, and then taking a really good, not actually billed as philosophy, but effectively philosophy class. And I've written about that. You can find that out there on the net very easily. A Tale of Two Philosophy Teachers is the article name. Um, and I think basically what got me into thinking about philosophy was probably speculative fiction. Thinking about metaphysical and epistemological and moral themes within that are raised within these stories by very smart authors. Like, what's the nature of the universe? Or can we actually know things for certain, or can we just have probabilities that we rely upon? Or what's the right thing to do? Or how should society be organized? But I can't like pinpoint any one particular book that drew me in. And I'd say maybe music also kind of figured into that as well. Thinking about the things that were framed in terms of lyrics in songs, right? Alfonso says you have frostbites on your hand. No, I have cat scratches on my hand. I volunteer at a cat shelter, and some of the cats will play rougher than others. But I'm never looking for advice about any health related matters. So always resist the temptation to give unasked for advice. Recommend a book on irrationalist philosophy. I mean, if we're just going to pull crap out of the air, we talked about Nietzsche a little bit earlier. Some people think of Nietzsche as an irrationalist, Beyond Good and Evil. There you go. Wonder Bread, do you have any favorite philosophy book covers aesthetically? No, I actually don't pay much attention to book covers. I typically take them off of hardcover books because I just they get in the way for me. Um, and I don't care that much about how the books look. I'm interested in what's in the books, so I don't really focus on that. I'm sort of confused. Do you think siblings can be helpful for each other in terms of artistic or philosophical growth? I find the success of the James brothers to be interesting in Hegel and his university roommates. We're talking about like Schelling, for example, and Hölderlin. So you know the examples that you're giving show that we're not just talking about siblings, but we're talking about people that are, let's say, congenial to you, that you have a close relationship with. So the two James brothers, William and Henry. Henry is known for being a novelist, and William is known for being a psychologist and a philosopher. I mean, if you're engaging with a sibling who, is interested in intellectual and literary and artistic matters, you can have some great conversations with them, right? But Hegel's example, Hegel, he wasn't like hanging out with his siblings; he's hanging out with his roommates, and they are sharing ideas as well. And this is often what happens when you go to like graduate school or even college, right? You meet people, and they're into the things that you're into, and then you connect with them. I mean, this can happen online. I would say the majority of the people that I interact with pretty regularly these days, in terms of intellectual matters, are not living here with me in Milwaukee. I mean, one exception, of course, would be my wife, and a few of my colleagues, but many of my good friends, like Mark Smith down there in South Africa, or Harald Kavli over in Norway, or all sorts of other people that I interact with regularly, and bounce ideas off of, and they do that with me. We we can do that virtually, right? Harold and I have been in the same place at the same time, exactly one time in our lives, and that was at Stoicon London 2018, where we met up face to face. I've never actually been in the same place at the same time as Mark Smith. I've met up with my friend Scott Terulli, a guitar professor at Berkeley, who I do the classic metal class with, exactly one time in our lives as well. So I think we can do this now virtually, and having people that um, you know you interact with and care about ideas with, yeah, that can be very helpful. All right, AB. I've been reading Nietzsche. I think it's good. Like others, you mentioned that at some point you were somewhat disillusioned by this philosophy. What was it for you? I wouldn't say disillusioned. I just realized that Nietzsche, like pretty much everybody else, has limitations. That sometimes he gets philosophers and their positions wrong, and he does so oftentimes because he's trying to fit them into, a narrative or a schema, or he misread them. I think that he's got a lot of really interesting ideas that are worth exploring, but that sometimes he can be a little bit too blanket. It's hard for him to resist coining a phrase like Christianity is Platonism for the masses, and you're like, well, okay, some Christianity might be, but that sure as hell isn't a true statement about Christianity as a totality. So it's things like that. There's also some incoherences in his thought, but those are sometimes interesting where you have to explore it more. Like think of the genealogy of morals, right? Everybody talks about the first essay and the difference between master morality and slave morality. But Nietzsche's thoughts on morality are way more complicated than that, right? There's also the debtor creditor relationship. There's also the development of religious conceptions and bad conscience that are coming about because of the strong actually being subordinated not by the weak but by others strong, right? There is the character of the priest who doesn't fit neatly into that schema either. So you got to kind of explore and see how it works. AE, would you encourage someone to go in chronological order when reading philosophy, and how would you tackle contemporary works that are based on older ideas you haven't read yet? Okay, so two different questions here, right? I mean, when people ask like, what should I read? I often say start with Plato, and kind of work your way forward. But that's just one of many different ways you can approach philosophy. It's not how I did it. I read existentialist figures and some at that time fairly recent stuff like finite and infinite games and things like that were philosophical when I was like out of high school and working and studying martial arts before I went in the army. And then in the army I read a few things here and there, and maybe I would have done better if I'd started with Plato. I don't know. I mean, there isn't like a recipe for this sort of thing. And what should you do with contemporary works that are based on older ideas you haven't read yet? Well, I mean, that one's pretty straightforward. If you want to understand what the hell they're talking about, you probably need to go to those older works, right? Or you're probably just not going to get half of what's being said. This is a big problem too. We often teach philosophy as if we can do all this great high theory without having a background and a basis in the earlier stuff. Like you see all these people, criticizing Cartesianism, and you're like, well, that's not what Descartes actually says. So clearly, this person hasn't recently read Descartes, or they're being just kind of a polemicist. Maybe we need to actually go back and see what Descartes actually says. So, all right. I'm sort of confused. Says it's fun when you're trying to interpret a text and think that you're onto something, even think it's helping you understand some dynamic in the world, then find out you were entirely off base. Well, if it's actually helping you to understand some dynamic in the world, then maybe the text wasn't the right text for it. But maybe if you've actually rightly identified some dynamic that exists in the world, now you've got something that you could yourself write about, right? So that could be fun too. But we often do have, experiences like that. I mean, there's so many people who I thought I actually understood when I first read them and then went back to them later and I'm like, oh man, I didn't understand this at all. I got this wrong. I wasn't, in the right frame of mind to read it, or, I mean, Stoicism is a great example of that. My first encounter with the Stoics was in college. I read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and I read Epictetus's Enchiridion, and I was like, I don't think this is really for me. I like this toughness part. I don't know what to make of this virtue talk, and um, it doesn't seem like a good philosophy for me. But that's because the mindset that I was in at the time, which made me much more willing to like read Sartre and um, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard to some degree. Although the religious part of Kierkegaard, I was like, yeah, I don't know if I buy that, right? Um, so this happens a lot. All right, Kanan, what are your thoughts on The Science of Logic by Hegel? Not sure why you put it in quotes. Although I do see students, this is a total side note, I see students doing this a lot. Somehow people get the idea that the title of a book should be in quotes. That's not the case. You put it in italics, right? And you put it in all caps generally. Somewhere somebody's teaching this, and I don't know where students are picking up on this, but it's a weird way of doing things. What are my thoughts on The Science of Logic? It's a real head cracker of a work, very complicated. Some people will tell you that they perfectly understand the relationship between the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic. It's not quite so simple in my point of view. There's parts that like line up with each other, and then a lot of parts that don't. There's a lot of cool stuff in the science of logic, but I don't know that it's necessarily worth the time to spend working through it. I will say this: in the 19th century and the early 20th century, the science of logic, the philosophy of right, and the encyclopedia logic were much more widely read than was the phenomenology of spirit. And that changed in the 20th century, largely, I would say, because of French and German scholarship and teaching on Hegel. So less people read the science of logic today than read the phenomenology of spirit. But it's a great book. You just got to decide whether it's worth the time that you're going to have to spend on it. Muhammad says, thanks for your work. What constitutes a good life in your own opinion? I mean, I would say I'm pretty Aristotelian in that respect. I think the life of virtuous activity, which means that you actually have to develop some degree of the virtues, which means you actually have to like figure out what the virtues actually are. And that takes a lot of doing. We don't just want to have, as I pointed out in videos recently with Alistair McIntyre, we don't want to just use virtue language without knowing what the hell we're talking about. And you do need to have some modicum of wealth, especially in the economy that we live in today. And relationships are incredibly important. I think that we could add some other components to that and widen the scope a bit. Our bodily health, which Aristotle does talk about, is important. We do want to think about what our legacy is and what kind of world we're leaving behind. And a good life could be one that's devoted to making things better for human beings or even for animals. Now, the second question, my view of Peter Singer's view that ordinary people are evil, I'm not sure where that's coming from. Um, I don't I don't recall a place where Peter Singer just flat out says ordinary people are evil. Um, but I mean, there's a lot of things that he thinks that in our contemporary way of approaching things are bad. He's devoted to animal liberation and rights, and so like insofar as most of us participate in a food system that involves a lot of suffering for animals, maybe that's what you have in mind there, but it's not like he says we can just simply abandon that. All right. Dan the Man says, I'm teaching asynchronous philosophy courses next spring at a community college. Going to be intro to philosophy and intro to ethics. Do you have any tips or advice? Yeah. So when we say asynchronous, just for the people out there who aren't familiar with this terminology, what we mean are classes that are not only online, but they don't have class meetings at a given time every week, right? So like I'm actually teaching a online synchronous religions of the world class next semester for Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. We will be meeting on Mondays, and I forget whether it's at 12:30 or maybe 3:15. But we'll meet using Google Meets, but we can meet using Zoom or anything like that. So asynchronous classes, they may proceed like on a weekly schedule, but you're not meeting weekly. And so there's some challenges involved with that. One is making sure that the students engage each other in a regular fashion, and so that's why you use like discussion forums. And discussion forums can be set up well. You want open-ended questions that they really have to think about. You want them complex enough so that their initial post isn't just "Yeah, I agree" or something like that. Um, and you want to make sure they're engaging each other, and you want to give them something about netiquette so they don't act like jerks to each other. And if you see them acting like jerks, get in there early on, and you got to read the discussion forums, right? You can't just let them go at it. And you'll also maybe see instances of plagiarism in discussion forums. I've had students who've copied each other's forums in the past. Maybe they thought the instructor wasn't paying attention. I mean, it's so easy to tell, right? And then, think about the other kinds of assignments that you want to make sure the students are engaging the work. And then think about the resources that you're going to provide them. So, um, videos are very helpful. As a matter of fact, it's recommended by Quality Matters, which is like the organization that does a lot of good certification for online classes, that you should have what we call framing videos for the class and for each week. And a framing video is nice and short, saying, hey, students, welcome to the class. Here's what we're going to be doing. You might want a video like that for each one of the major kinds of assignments that you have, like discussion forums. Make a video, because students really benefit from the engagement with the instructor, even in video format, right? So you're saying like, Here's what I'm looking for in discussion forums," right? And it doesn't have to be perfect. As a matter of fact, like, look at this background, right? Students are fine with it being kind of just a regular lived-in background. Doesn't have to be beautiful. You don't have to have scripts or anything, but you do want to have stuff that they can like feel engaged with, and try to provide them with lecture videos or podcast episodes or um, good blog posts or um, handouts or things like that. Lesson pages on the material that you're going to be studying, and it doesn't have to be perfect. That's the last bit of advice that I'll give you. It doesn't have to be perfect in order to be good for your students. So, all right, JM Cannon, where would you suggest starting with Young? I wouldn't. I'm not into Young. So, uh, let's see here. Just skipped up a little bit. Boki, did you ever read Evald Ilenkov? I have not. What do you think of the folkish movement and the thinkers of the conservative revolution of the 30s of the previous century? I think they're full of crap and, mainly went in the wrong directions. So, Jefferson Orsino, can you speak of your religious journey in life? Yeah, I mean, I've always been, you could say, thinking about like cosmological and metaphysical issues throughout my life. I was raised here in Wisconsin. I'm pointing that way because I was raised about 30 miles to the west of here in an area that at that time was kind of country, kind of rural. And, I went to Catholic church because my parents were Catholic. My dad kind of nominally so. My mom perhaps a little bit more devout. And Just about everybody I knew was either Catholic or Lutheran or Presbyterian. And if they were Presbyterian, they were from the village of Wales because that's where we had the Presbyterians. And nobody really knew anything. They made you go to what's called CCD, which is Catechesis and Christian Doctrine, once a week, and that was pretty piss poor as far as actual catechesis. And so, by the time that I got into high school, um, and I was going to Catholic high school. I was kind of like, oh, this is all BS. None of this really matters much. The people that are teaching the religion classes don't really know much of anything. And I left the church, and they were so cool back then that they were like, yeah, you don't have to stand up in mass. You can protest if you want, that's fine. And then later on in life, I'd still go to mass every once in a while with my family because it was a family thing. But I didn't, I wasn't particularly interested. And I was, studying people like Nietzsche and Sartre and even Descartes, nominally Christian, not really a Christian. He's more of a deist. And so, that went on for quite a while. And then I ended up, interestingly, reading people like Thomas Aquinas and Anselm of Canterbury to work on my Latin. And I found that they had really great depth of thought. And I started reading more and more people, and particularly getting into the works of Maurice Blondel and other similar thinkers, and found my way back to it. I'm not happy with what's happened in the American Catholic Church in terms of right wingers essentially taking over large parts of it, and getting too involved in culture wars rather than actual, sacramental religion. Um, and there's other issues as well that I think are real problems. So you can say I'm wrestling with God, throughout my life. Um, and I think that I really like reading religious thinkers, particularly the ones, as I've said many times, for whom becoming religious didn't solve any of their problems. It didn't answer all their questions. It just made things more complicated and, in some respects, more pressing in terms of questions that had to be sorted out. So, Ultimate artist, what are your thoughts on wokeness? I think anybody who talks about wokeness is stupid or a grifter, or, wasting all of our time. And there is a woke mind virus out there, but it's the anti woke mind virus, the people who obsess about wokeness. And give it another 3 years, and that term will have dropped out of our vocabulary, just like postmodern, blah blah blah, and pick whatever else you want. Conservatives these days are not conservative at all, because they can't even like retain the same vocabulary from year to year to year about the stuff that they get their panties in a bunch about. So that's my thoughts about that. Um, Sean Costello criticizing Cartesianism, spot on. I assume you mean like saying if you're going to criticize Cartesianism, you actually have to know what Descartes says. Mohammed says, is political philosophy the same as political theory? If yes, then what is the real difference? Well, if yes, then there isn't a real difference, right? If no, what is the real difference? And the answer is sort of like the one I gave about existentialism and absurdism prior. They overlap. I mean, you could think of political theory as being part of political philosophy, or either way, but there isn't like a strict dividing line between the two of them. All right. Let's see here. Oh, Ken, good to see you. Is there a particular translation of dialogues and essays by Seneca that you would recommend? Um, you know, there isn't an edition of dialogues and essays called such, but there are some newer translations that University of Chicago Press published a while back, and so they've got the letters to Lucilius in one volume, and then there's a bunch of other volumes. Like On Benefits is another whole volume, because that's a long book, and then there's one called Happiness and Hardship that has a lot of the essays in it that are quite good, like on the happy life, on shortness of life, all of the consolations and all that sort of stuff. There's another one called Anger, Mercy, uh, Revenge, which has on anger and on clemency in it. So, I mean, I think those, I mean, they can be a little pricey because they're newer books, but I think those are really the good ones. A lot of noise outside because they're doing some construction stuff. I don't know if you hear that, but it seems to be pretty loud. Um, so Ultimate Artist looks like they're being kind of a jerk on here. So I guess it's time to remove them. It's too bad, because you don't want to be a jerk on somebody else's front porch. Caleb says, I'm a psychotherapist and find that my most satisfying sessions are those that turn into a philosophical edification of sorts. Just want to let you know I refer folks to your channel frequently. Well, that's good. I mean, psychotherapy, there's, and you probably have seen this, there's a tendency for people to like turn it into a bunch of techniques. This is the big danger with the cognitive revolution that's happened in, the last, say, half century. Freudian approaches, psychoanalysis, were dominating for a long time, and then the cognitive behavior, REBT, CBT, DBT, all these cognitive approaches wound up essentially replacing it and talking about how they could, beat everybody else out, and they were evidence based and all that. But it easily turns into, when it's not being done in a thoughtful way, just a bunch of techniques. And we don't want to do that. We want to bring something like, a philosophical approach to dealing with people's psyches, because they're pretty damn complicated, right? And there's a lot of different factors involved. So that's great to read. All right. Gilbert Bates started digging into being and nothingness. I like it a lot. There's a lot of interesting ideas, but it's tough going. It fries your brain. Is there some particular idea that you find interesting? Oh, yeah. I mean, early on, Sartre's ideas about the for itself and the in itself, which he takes, that's sort of Hegelian language, but he's doing a very different thing than Hegel did with it in like the Phenomenology. And this is part of what I found so attractive about Sartre. Being in Nothingness was like the first big philosophy book that I read my way through, and I did that as an undergraduate, and I thought it was just brilliant. Now, of course, I see some shortcomings, but yeah, the idea that human freedom is so free that it cannot be defined into just one thing or another, and that is part of what it is to be a being for itself. I think that's really kind of a brilliant insight on his part. Um, Luke says, how would you answer someone who argues that conservative academics are censored or prevented from winning funding? I have a hard time responding to conspiratorial thinking. Don't respond to it. Don't engage with it. I mean, if people want to be crackpots and whine about all sorts of non-existent problems, I mean, has any conservative ever been turned down for funding on the basis of being a conservative? Sure. I mean, you can find anybody, any sort of status. There's people who've been turned down for funding because their hair was too long or too short, or somebody didn't like the way that they looked or something like that. But anybody who knows anything about academia knows that all of this conservative whining and bitching and belly aching about how there's no place for them in academia is just a bunch of like exactly that whining. you know there's plenty of room for it because there's plenty of conservatives out there in academia. I know some of them. And what people don't like are lazy, entitled whiners. And that's unfortunately what most people who call themselves conservatives these days actually turn out to be. It's really quite sad because, again, conservatives did not manage to conserve anything good about conservatism. So, yeah. All right. So MM has some clarification about the Peter Singer thing. It is in a thumbnail by a YouTuber. The video is concerned with a controversial essay on morality by Singer. The title is provocative. My guy built upon it. Yeah, there you go. So not the real thing, but rather, you know, um, a mistaken view on Singer done specifically to try to get some clout out there in YouTube. So, yeah, there you go. All right. Impulsive. You've said previously that Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety isn't the most illuminating text on the topic of anxiety he wrote. Which work would you say is the best for that? I didn't say that. That it's not the most illuminating text on the topic of anxiety. I think I probably said it's probably not the most illuminating text. Read it, then read The Sickness Unto Death and read um, Fear and Trembling. I mean, why do you fear and tremble? Because you're living in anxiety, right? So, there's a number of ones. Zachary, any tips on acquiring recommendation letters for grad school? Have you written any for students? I have written some for students in the past. I typically don't anymore because, I'm an adjunct. So I'm not usually teaching students in their major classes, and I'm not getting to build a relationship with students over a long time, right? So if they're coming to me for a letter of recommendation, I'm like, you need to be reaching out to people who know you better and can say something more about your studies, right? Not me. Now there are exceptions to that. I've written letters of recommendation for young high school students who've studied with me extensively over the course of years as private tutorials, right? But I think what you want to do is you want to think about, okay, who knows you well enough to comment on the things that people would actually care about. in terms of your application. So people who can say, yeah, this person really gets their work done on time and up to standards and is thoughtful about it. And here's some things that I've noticed about them over the years. So you want to think about who can actually write you a good letter of recommendation, a letter of recommendation that tells people about who you are. And if you don't have any, now's the time to start making those connections before you hit them up for the letter, because otherwise they might be like, I don't really know you. I don't know what I would say, you know? All right, blank name. How would you deal with envy of other people? I notice when somebody is envious of something I have, I feel bad. I know I also get envious sometimes. Well, I mean, you want to think about precisely that. Why do you feel bad when somebody else who's none of your damn business gets envious about something that you have? Why do you let that affect you? What's your thought process? What's going on with that? And then once you actually start figuring that out and making it manifest for yourself, then you can, start deciding whether it's rational or not for you to be bothered by other people being envious of you. Um, and whether you get envious of other people or not doesn't have anything to do with the question of you feeling bad about them being envious of you. Those are two separate issues. I mean, who doesn't get envious of somebody about something, right? Um, but that doesn't have to turn into us feeling bad because somebody else happens to have this emotion towards what we have. Awful philosophy. I've been getting into phenomenology and cannot reconcile Husserl and Heidegger. Feels like they're doing very different things. Any advice? Yeah, don't reconcile Husserl and Heidegger. Nobody says that you have to. They are doing different things. As a matter of fact, not only are Husserl and Heidegger doing different things, so is Edith Stein, so is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, so is Max Scheler, just to name several other important um, phenomenologists of that time. They're all doing different things because there is no one single thing out there called phenomenology that they all buy into. There's a phenomenological movement, which is very broad, sort of like existentialism, which, by the way, a lot of overlap between phenomenology and existentialism. Some phenomenologists are existentialists, some phenomenologists are not. Some existentialists are phenomenologists, some existentialists are not, right? So you don't have to reconcile these thinkers with each other. Just try to figure out what the hell they're actually saying, and then be okay with comparing and contrasting them with each other. Joseph says, if you were to learn philosophy chronologically, who are the main philosophers of each major era you would focus on the most? Kind of depends on what you consider to be major eras, right? I mean, we often distinguish between like Hellenic philosophy and Hellenistic philosophy, but Aristotle should actually be in Hellenistic because, he's writing in the time after the Greek city-state has basically come to an end. Plato, Aristotle, if you want to study ancient philosophy, Cicero is very important, and you get a lot of other great stuff through him. Seneca for the Stoics, obviously, and Epictetus. We don't have much from the Epicureans, unfortunately, but you want to read what's available. Sextus Empiricus for the skeptics. Then we get into all this, late antiquity, early medieval, Augustine, Boethius, John Cassian. We could go on and on and on and on and on, right? There isn't a main philosophers of each major era that you would focus on the most, because that's part of what you're trying to figure out as you're going through it, right? All right. Impulsive says, speaking of phenomenology, are you interested in Levinas at all? Not much. I mean, I had to read Levinas in graduate school. He was a big deal back then. I kind of got turned off by the Levinasians that were out there because all they ever wanted to do was talk about the face of the other and how we efface the other, and we can never truly do justice to the other, and other. And I think they ignored the other stuff in Levinas that was interesting. And if you can't really have a good conversation with people about the philosophers that you're interested in, and you can study other philosophers, why are you going to spend time on that thinker? And I say that as somebody who actually studied with somebody who was one of the earliest English translators of Levinas, Garth Gillen, who worked with Alfonso Lingus and eventually withdrew from the project, but who was very, very interested in Levinas, but who also saw this problem with Levinasians. So, I mean, maybe if I have time, I'll go back and reread, some of Levinas's works, but I got so much other stuff going on that I think other people could maybe do that instead. We don't always all have to read the same people. So, all right. Nolan says, have you ever read Solitude by Anthony Storr? I don't even know who Anthony Storr is. So whether he's a philosopher or literary figure or something like that. So no, I haven't read him. Sad to say. Do you prose maybe? Do you think philosophy matters at all in major real scenes of life, conflicts, and political arena? Where are the philosophers, especially ethics experts, having their voices heard? Well, these are two totally different questions, right? Where are the philosophers, moralists, ethics experts having their voices heard? Where people are reading them or listening to them. I mean, all you got to do is spend a little bit of time out there, and you're going to find philosophers saying things about all sorts of interesting topics, right? But it's not as if people are jumping over themselves to bring in philosophers to talk about the latest incident in international politics, even though they could, right? And that's in part because the people who are engaging in opinion formation generally haven't studied much philosophy, or if they did, they studied with people who weren't very good at it. But does philosophy matter in scenes of life, conflicts, and in the political arena? Of course. I mean, people are always doing philosophy. It's very often bad philosophy, but you can be studying philosophy and bringing it in ways that ordinary people can appreciate. And it's part of what I do in my career, right? I've been doing that for more than a decade with Reason.io in sort of an official capacity, doing like ethics consulting for organizations and, executive coaching. That's all doing philosophy stuff. So, all right. Box 23. How important is the school I attend for a master's in philosophy? There's no like definitive answer to that. It depends on the program that you're applying to for a master's. Like I mentioned earlier, hundreds of them that you could apply to here in the United States, and they all have different standards, and they're all going to go through a different procedure in deciding whether to let you in or not. So that is the sort of question that you need to ask the graduate student advisor, or graduate admissions advisor for the schools that you're applying to, and you might get very different answers, and they may lie to you about these questions as well. So all right. David Marazzo says, are you familiar with the consolation of philosophy, Boethius? No, tell me more about that. I mean, I did shoot a sequence of videos on Boethius, and I did give a talk in the Philosophers in the Midst of History sequence on Boethius, if I'm not mistaken. But maybe I've never heard of that guy ever in my life. What do you think? Blank name. Did you read most of the philosophers you've read while in school or when you got out of grad school? I'd say probably I've read more since I got out of grad school, but you got to remember that I finished graduate school over 20 years ago in 2002. So I've been out in the field working, reading, teaching, writing, all that sort of stuff for 2 decades, you know? So there's quite a few people who I may some of them I read in graduate school, but didn't read as much. A great example of that would be Immanuel Kant, right? I mean, you had to read Kant's first critique, second critique, groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, prolegomena, just to take your preliminary examinations, right? And I read some other stuff like Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, and I read the Metaphysics of Morals too. And the Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View. But I've read some of those subsequently and realized that the reading that I had in graduate school might not have been quite so good, you know. Um, I think there's a lot of things that I read after graduate school, and then there's quite a few that I deepened my reading of, or I widened my reading of. Joseph says the YouTube algorithm just showed me your cat Sassy munching on your food. What an appetite! Yeah, she was a very motivated animal, as they call them, right? She was a great cat. She was also very pushy. She was the top animal in our house, and that included 2 dogs, one of whom was over 100 pounds at her peak. She was 120 pounds. The other one was, I think, topped off actually at 105 at his peak as well. And she would boss them around, because she was an adult when they were puppies. So, all right, Rexel, what is the frontier of philosophical studies right now? Much like what theory of everything is for physics, if there is any. There isn't any. I mean, that's all bullshit stuff. Anybody who tells you this is the cutting edge, this is the frontier, there isn't one single thing like that. There's all sorts of things happening, and nobody has like a complete comprehensive view on it, because there's like tens of thousands of people doing philosophical work in interesting ways at this point in time. Even with physics, most people aren't working on a theory of everything. Most people are doing, basic research stuff in this area, this area, this area, So David says, are those videos available on YouTube? I don't know enough to feel comfortable to comment. I mean, all you got to do, any YouTube channel, you just go into the channel and then you use the search function and you can see what anybody has. It's super easy to do. Or you can just type in Gregory Sadler Boethius and you'll see the videos come up in Google as well. Burin says, writings of Hegel and such philosophers are so complex. Any guidelines for reading them? Well, I've got videos on how to do self-directed study on Hegel. So you might want to watch that video and see what it recommends for you. But yeah, philosophy is complicated. Actually, anything at a high level is complicated. Be willing to deal with it being difficult and complicated and having to go over it multiple times and make your best attempt at it, use secondary sources when you find that they're helpful. Make sure that that doesn't distract you from actually reading the text itself. And that's about it that we can say. Dia Prose says, when studying philosophical literature, did you have a reading, debating group or an adversary to hone your understanding and philosophical skills? I think adversaries and debates are highly overrated. It's a great way to get drawn into personality conflicts and one-upmanship rather than actual study. And I think that's not just for philosophy, but for many other things. You can hone your skills in many ways that are not antagonistic, and focusing on the antagonistic will probably result in you developing certain skills and not developing others. Sometimes we had reading groups. I mean, oftentimes we had classes. I took graduate level classes, for example, on, Ludwig Wittgenstein and Theodor Adorno and, Hegel and Nietzsche and Merleau-Ponty and all these other interesting thinkers. And then we also did have reading groups. Like we had a Kierkegaard reading group for a while. We had a Hegel reading group that spent an entire year going through the Phenomenology of Spirit. What else did we do reading groups on? De Saussure's Cours de Linguistique Générale. a bunch of other things as well. And that can be nice, right? If the other people are actually doing the reading, if they have something to bring to it, working on things together can be quite helpful. Zachary, do you think virtue is a skill that could be developed? No, it's not a skill. It's a disposition, and it's not a disposition. It is an entire set of dispositions. There is virtue, the generic term, and then there are the virtues, plural, right? So, if so, could the truly virtuous agent make decisions just like an expert? And could this be how the virtuous agent just knows what's right? There's analogies, but it's not a skill. And even real expertise is not just a skill either. It's disposition, knowledge, narrative, all these other things brought together, right? So you want to avoid trying to have a sort of reductive view on what the virtues are. Reza, I started the academic study of BA philosophy at the age of 41. Do you think I have the intellectual capacity to make it to the PhD? I wouldn't know because I don't know you, you know? It's not just a matter of intellectual capacity. It's also a matter of having the ability to, take the time to intensively study things and having the opportunities to do that. I mean, if you're working a regular job, you're probably not going to do a PhD, even if you are motivated and intellectually capable of it. There's a lot of different uh, ramifications to that. All right. Let's see. Well, we're getting close to the time. Let's see if we can take somebody who hasn't said something. Actually, let me do a follow up on Reza. So, the fact of age and dwindling intellectual power. There's nothing about age that means you're having dwindling intellectual power. As a matter of fact, a lot of the great philosophy stuff is done by people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Look at Alistair McIntyre or Jürgen Habermas still working in their 90s. There's nothing that says that you're going to have dwindling intellectual power. As a matter of fact, you can find, as many people do, that you're actually better off in your middle age than down the line. All right, so let's see here. Vegan sports bar. Do you think it's possible to work a full-time job and self-study philosophy, or am I screwed? Yeah, it's possible. I mean, you just have to decide what you want to do. The time that you're studying philosophy, you're not spending watching shows on Netflix or, bullshitting around in a bar or something like that. It's certainly possible. I mean, I did it. I worked full-time jobs when I wasn't in graduate school, actually more than full-time, and studied philosophy and studied languages. But you're going to have to make certain sacrifices. It's going to take discipline and all of that. So, all right. So let's see. Orville 999. If the Athenians considered piety so important, why did they execute Socrates, even though the Oracle of Delphi said he was the wisest of the Greeks? So the Oracle of Delphi didn't say he was the wisest of the Greeks. This is why it's really important to pay close attention to what's actually said and not rely upon sort of like glosses on it. What does it actually say in the Apology? What did the Oracle tell Chaerephon according to Socrates? Is there anyone wiser than Socrates? No. That doesn't mean he's the wisest. That just means there's nobody wiser. And why would the Athenians give a shit what Socrates tells in his story? I mean, anybody could make up a story like that on the spot. I mean, you want to think these things through in a non-abstract kind of way, right? So, all right. Let's see. We've got a bunch of back and forth here about pure being and Hegel, which I'm going to skip over. Let's see if there's a good one to go out on. So vegan sports bar. Do you think Plato would have allowed heavy metal for the soldiers, but not for the masses? Plato's not worried so much in the Republic about the style of music. He's interested in the modes because he thinks of them, and so does Aristotle, by the way, in Politics. I want to say book 7 thinks that the different modes encourage different kinds of emotional responses. And you might be right about that. I think it's a little bit too reductionist. And their heavy metal names a lot of different things. So it depends on who you're talking about. If we're just sticking to like what we call classic heavy metal from the 70s and 80s, maybe Plato would have let the auxiliaries or the fighting troops have some of that, but probably would have discouraged it for the masses. But the worry would be about it getting our thumos too riled up. And interestingly, one of the things that we found through research is that people who regularly listen to heavy metal often the music doesn't make them like angrier, more aggressive. It helps to like stabilize their mood and sometimes calm them down. So that's a good place to end here. We've got a bunch of other things, people still going on about um, being and nothingness and stuff like that. Remember too that with that, Hegel is using terminology very often differently than other people are using it. So that might be helpful in thinking that question through. All right, so I got to go because I got to eat some lunch, and then I've got another event I've got to do for Patreon supporters. So I will see all of you somewhere else in the ether. Thanks for all the good questions and comments. And we've got a lot of other cool stuff coming up in the following weeks. You can always go to the channel to find that out, or you can find stuff in the Reason.io events calendar, or by going to my Facebook page where I tend to post events as well. If you're in the Milwaukee area, I'm going to be speaking at the Frank Weinberg Library on Wednesday, doing a Philosophers in the Midst of History about David Hume. And then we come up to Thanksgiving, at least here in the States. So that'll be fun as well. So I will see all of you, and take it easy on your end.